This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So thank you very much. I'm sorry for the delay. I have a lot of problems with my travel. I was supposed to arrive yesterday. Okay. I'm going to briefly present you a possible alternative to the situation that is facing, that several countries in Latin America are facing the option of a deeper expansion of mining and oil extractive industries in the region, which is creating a new set of social and environmental problems. I'm going to present the experience of Ecuador, which has been linked with oil for the last 40 years, and an option that the government of Ecuador presented to the United Nations, which is the Yasuni ITT initiative. Well, briefly, as you know, Ecuador has both very important trades. First, it is an oil exporter country since the 1970s. Currently, crude oil accounts for about 57% of exports and about 25% of the state income, which is still very important. But at the same time, as oil has been extracted from the Amazonian region, the environmental impact of oil extraction has been regarded one of the highest in the planet. So we have a very serious contradiction here. The Ecuador-Amazonian rain basin is one of the richest in terms of biodiversity, and particularly the Yasuni National Park, which is located in the eastern area. I'm going to show you some maps. According with the recent research, has been regarded as the most important biodiversity hotspot in the Western Hemisphere. But at the same time, the park has a very, very large oil reserve, which accounts for about 20% of unexploited reserves in the country. In 2007, President Correa decided to present to the United Nations the idea that Ecuador will be willing to keep unexploited, indefinitely unexploited, indefinitely underground, this huge oil reserve in order to preserve biodiversity and reduce global warming, if an international contribution can be set up so that Ecuador will receive at least half of the potential revenues of oil extraction. That's the essential idea of the Yasuni ITT initiative. I'm going to present very briefly some very important traits of the initiative. First, well, as I mentioned, in spite of the fact that Ecuador has been extracting oil for more than 4 decades, actually poverty is still very high. The country has a very serious problem of structural unemployment, and several studies, not only in Ecuador but all over Latin America, have demonstrated that usually extractive economies are less prone to development than other economies in the region. That means that the link between oil extraction and development is very difficult to find and to demonstrate. Here we have the Ecuadorian experience since the 1950s to present. As you can see, when the country in this oil boom, just in the middle of the chart, you can see that we have 1 decade of very important economic expansion, and after that, actually per capita income almost stagnated in the country, so that the average growth rate of per capita income during the oil period has been a little bit more than 1% per year, which is very low. Here we have a map about the biodiversity in the country, and Ecuador actually has is one of the 2 or 3 countries with the highest biodiversity indicators, particularly concerning the number of species per square kilometer. Here we have a kind of ecological footprint of Ecuador, the results of human intervention. In the Amazonian region, we have, in the northern Amazonian region where oil extraction is located, the red areas are referring to completely deforested areas, which means a non-reversible process. And in the eastern area, you can see the Yasuni National Park and the Guarani land, which is still undisturbed, and as I say, it has a very high biological importance. Here we have the future of Ecuador, and that's very important. Here we have the potential extraction capability of the country, and oil reserves in Ecuador, as opposed to the case of Venezuela, will last for about, maybe allow the country 20 more years of net exports. And now exported volumes are beginning to decline, and actually they declined for about 25% since 2004. That means that the country badly needs a transition towards a sustainable economy. Actually, this transition can be based in sustainable use of biodiversity. That's the idea. Here we have some information about the Yasuni National Park in terms of these unique characteristics. We have here maps about concentration of amphibian, birds, mammals, and plants in the Amazonian region. If you overlap over them, you find out that only in the western side of the Amazonian region, in the land that belongs to Ecuador, this red hotspot means that you will find at the same time the highest concentration of these 4 orders. That means that it is the most important biological reserve in the whole Amazonian region and in the western hemisphere. That's why to preserve this area is not only important for Ecuador, but for the humankind as a whole. Well, this is a very interesting bird that is located in the Yasuni National Park, and here we have some important traits of the Yasuni proposal. First, keeping unexploited this huge amount of oil, 850 tons, 850 million barrels of oil, means that we are going to save 400 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions. This amount is equivalent or higher than annual emissions coming from France or Brazil. So the contribution to climate change mitigation of the initiative actually is very high. In addition to that, the idea is that these funds that will be administered by the United Nations, it can be invested only in developing alternative clean energy sources and reducing deforestation and investing in social development. And the United Nations, the UNDP, is the administrator of the fund. That means that we are achieving at the same time an important policy in terms of biodiversity conservation, sustainable social development, and the protection of the two still isolated indigenous cultures that survive in the park. Well, that is why I think the Yasuni ITT initiative has received a very important support from several institutions, including the German parliament, several Nobel laureates, and other governments, and the United Nations. Here it's the structure of the fund. I think a very, very important point that Ecuador is, here we have some details about the way in which the implementation of the initiative can contribute to reducing deforestation, completely eliminating deforestation in Ecuador in a 30-year period. And finally, I would like to present the idea that in spite of the fact that current climate change international negotiations towards a binding agreement are facing a very difficult situation since the Copenhagen summit in 2009, it seems that first a new international agreement is absolutely needed. Secondly, there are several ways in which we can reduce or mitigate emissions. I want to mention a recent research from a German team of scientific researchers led by Mannhausen. They conclude that if we burn all the currently proven reserves in the planet of fossil fuels, the temperature at the end of this century will reach between 4 and 7 centigrade degrees above the current levels. That means a really catastrophic situation for mankind. The only way in which we can keep global warming at safe levels, that means below 2 centigrade degrees, is to keep unexploited at least half of the world reserves of fossil fuels. And Ecuador is the first country to present this new way of mitigation, taking into account that the current Kyoto-based mechanisms are important but are not enough. We need to find additional ways, such as avoided emissions by deforestation or degradation, but Ecuador presented a new idea that is avoiding emissions for keeping fossil fuels unexploited in countries which are at the same time developing countries, mega-diverse countries, and countries with a rich potential in fossil fuels. That's essentially the idea, and I think, well, I presented very briefly some of the basic traits of the initiative. I would like to have some discussion about it. Sorry for the delay.
Oh. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you so much for coming. Such a cogent presentation after a very long journey indeed. We're slightly over time, but we did have a fire alarm. So we'll just take a few questions and we'll go for a glass of wine. So questions for Carlos on the Yasuni initiative, or general reflections on the day as a whole?
Carlos, Gordon Hutchison from the Bebbington and Peru Squadron. With the new government in Ecuador, Korea's new government, and the new Congreso, Parlamento, is there still a strong commitment to continue with the mini projects? Well, and also, just what is the support from the civil society organizations, CONAI, indigenous, ONGs de medio ambiente, and sindicatos in relación a Korea?
Yeah. Well, beginning with your second question, we have made several opinion polls in Ecuador, and we find that about 85% of the public opinion in the country agrees with the idea of keeping oil in the ground in the Yasuni. So the public support for the initiative has been very strong, and it has been increasing in the last years. Officially, the government still is favorable of the initiative. I don't find a completely coherent environmental policy in the case of Ecuador, because at the same time they are trying to expand oil extraction in other places in the Amazonian region, and there is not a comprehensive policy with a shift to a sustainable economy. They are promoting also mining activities in the southern Amazonian region and so on. So I cannot be sure that the next government of Korea will keep the same idea, but it seems very probable, because first of the national support of to the initiative, and secondly, given the international importance that the issue of keeping biodiversity in the Yasuni National Park has reached in the last years. If we think 5 years ago, nobody knows where the Yasuni National Park is located, or this specific very peculiar characteristics in terms of biodiversity, and now the situation is very different. So I think given the huge international support that the Yasuni initiative received, I expect that the government will keep it and continue pushing the idea of creating new ways of mitigation.
I really like this proposal, but I suppose I've got some doubts about its viability as a model for the problem of climate change, because it depends on overseas funders finding the funding to pay Ecuador and the other oil-producing countries, or the other countries with oil reserves. And yet the rest of the world is addicted to oil. So essentially we have to both find the money and decarbonise our economies, and do that on a global scale, because on our own direct emissions you can show that we've decarbonised to some extent, but that's only because we've outsourced emissions to places like China. So I suppose where next with an initiative like this in terms of the global strategy, given the failure of the global accords anyway, perhaps wouldn't, because they're based on carbon trading, probably wouldn't have worked anyway.
Yes, I think, the current mechanisms of mitigation have not been very successful in the past. You mentioned the case of carbon trading. Actually, the carbon market is collapsed, and there is no other way of effective way of mitigation worldwide. That's why a new international binding agreement on climate change is necessary. Maybe it can be postponed for 2 more or 3 more years, but in the medium term, I think is the only way to avoid a climate crisis, a very, very deep climate crisis in the future. And in this new agreement, I think new mechanisms are also required. That's why I think we expect that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change will push a new agreement, and we expect that in the new agreement not only market-based mechanism will be allowed, but other ways in which this kind of international financing, effective financing to reduce emission can be allowed. And in my opinion, this is one of the important options. It's not a unique option, but obviously it can be a very important contribution in the future of climate change negotiations. By the way, in the case of Ecuador, we defined a 13-year period of fundraising. So obviously, since 2008, the international crisis and also the stalemates of climate change negotiation in Copenhagen have been very adverse. However, I think if we think in the future, the amount of money that Ecuador is asking for is equivalent to a contribution of $1 per person in developed countries during a period of 10 years. That's not a huge contribution if we think in terms of per capita contributions. That is why I think it is still feasible, but it requires both, I think, a deep commitment from the Ecuadorian side, from the Ecuadorian government, and at the same time a change in the current conditions of international negotiation.
I'll just take a final question from Cameron.
Yeah. Sorry, I just have 2 quick questions. One, how much money have you been able to raise to date for the fund? And also, why is it attached to funds? Why did the state not make the decision to protect the Yasuni Park? Because they have the obligation to protect the nature and the indigenous peoples that have not been contacted. Why does it have to be linked to money?
Yes, this is a very important question. Well, the fund already has about $100 million, which is not very high compared with the goal, but it is very important as a beginning. Actually, in the new constitution of Ecuador, there is a ban to extractive activities within national parks, and only the president has the capacity to present under special condition to ask for an exception that needs to be approved by the Congress. So actually, the new constitution set up a much stronger legal conditionality to extracting oil in national parks, and it will be a very important step from the government to continue protecting the park. I'm not sure that it will be the case in the next years, because the government is facing a difficult situation in terms of the exhaustion of oil, conventional oil extraction, and the lack of short-term opportunities to increase public income. So I'm not sure what will be the decision in the future, but the position you are presenting, the idea that Ecuador in any case must continue doing that, I think is very necessary from the environmental perspective, and at the same time I think for a coherent position of Ecuador in this part.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I think we'd better leave it there because we're over time, but it was a very hopeful yet unproven note to finish on, and perhaps we can continue the conversation over a drink outside. But I'd just like to thank the ISA for hosting us today and supporting the conference. All our speakers, especially those who have come from overseas or from other parts of the UK to see it, and for all of you for coming and participating. And please do visit the anti-extractive.org website, where we'll continue to post information and you'll be able to comment and we can continue the debate.